Good afternoon. It is Wednesday, March the 24th, and the timing of this conversation is particularly pertinent, is it not? As today was initially classed as the day we hope to be exiting lockdown. There's no doubt the COVID-19 pandemic is having an impact on everyone's lives, but realistically, with at least another fortnight under the current measures, how are you getting on? You may be bored, fed up, frustrated, you may be enjoying a more laid-back way of life, but what of those of you who are really struggling, who are feeling low, lonely, anxious, depressed, very different things, of course, concerned about your health or that of those close to you? Well, here to hopefully help and allay some of those concerns today, to discuss that most precious of assets, our emotional health and well-being, are the head of mental health in the Isle of Man, Ross Bailey, and on Zoom from the Island Listen charity, the consultant clinical psychologist, Professor Robin Davidson, and child and adolescent psychotherapist, Lynsey Christian. Good afternoon, one and all. Thank you for your time. And let us be honest, areas of mental health, the mental health service, are overstretched and overfunded even before COVID reared its head. So there are quite a few issues I want to tackle and explore with you in a moment, Ross Bailey. But let me start with you, Lynsey, for any parents watching this, if I may, because I've witnessed it in recent weeks, and I'm sure a number of people have. Children and young people really struggling. Physical and mental health are very closely linked, of course. Just to start us off, how can parents talk to their children about coronavirus without making them anxious?
Afternoon, Ross. So I think the main thing really at the moment is for parents to have open conversations with their children, regardless of age. And I think it's really important that people and parents do have age-appropriate conversations with their children. So it's really about gauging what information your children need to know. So it's about keeping the information concise and factual, but not overwhelming a child, so they don't take on those real worries or concerns. But I do think it's important that children are kept up to date on information about what's happening, especially on the island in terms of the government restrictions and what their day-to-day life looks like. But it really is important that parents gauge at a right level. So really think about your children as individuals and what information is appropriate for them to know, and be very much led by your children. So if a child is asking questions, try and answer those questions in a really open and honest way.
Are you actually hearing and witnessing, indeed, cases where young people are more concerned than perhaps they normally would be this time?
Yeah, and I think that's understandable given the circumstances. We're in a very unprecedented time. Who could have imagined that just over a year ago we'd be sitting here in our third lockdown on the island? I don't think anybody would have really thought that. And it's really important to understand that actually, regardless of how old you are, when we are in difficult times, people do struggle, and that struggle usually is with our mental health. So whether you've had a pre-existing mental health condition or whether you are struggling because of our current lockdown or previous lockdowns, but we have seen probably an increase in people concerned with their mental health and struggling with their mental health, and that's really important that we do really take that on board and try and support and help those people where needed.
Ross Bailey, what are your initial thoughts then about the backlash of this pandemic? Because more and more people we're hearing are having anxiety disorders. The CAM service, child, adolescent and mental health, in some areas, I think respectfully, is hardly touching the side of the problems. There are numerous appointments now on the phone rather than face-to-face. Specialist treatments are being delayed. People are waiting to get onto the system indefinitely in some cases. There is a bit of a ticking time bomb there. I'm sure you agree, wherever you look. What investment is being made in the mental health service for the future? For this once this pandemic, however long it lasts, once this lockdown is over, what investment's being made in the future of the Isle of Man's mental health service, and at what level?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, as I know, Robin, I speak a little bit in terms of the evidence base, but we know the sort of certainly suggested that we're going to experience another pandemic following this, and that's a mental health pandemic. The emotional well-being of the community, has been significantly impacted by the current pandemic. There's a huge amount of work going on, James, in terms of the mental health service and how we've learnt from the current model of delivery and what we can do differently going forward. I think one of the arguably one of the biggest shifts really is a recent awarding of funding to significantly increase our access to talking therapies. Certainly this year we're looking at recruiting an additional 9 therapists, which is going to make an enormous difference in terms of timely access to NICE, so the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, evidence-based treatments. So we're looking we're currently recruiting now those therapists, and we'll be embedding those in primary care, so working with our GP colleagues in a much more integrated and collaborative way. We're also really looking at how we can work in a much more seamless way with our third sector colleagues, because they bring an enormous wealth of experience and skills to the table. So we're looking at how we can work with those services. IML Listen is one example of the fantastic resources that are out there. But it means us working in a much more joined up collaborative, absolutely collaborative way, and filling some of those gaps that we know are there. Adding on to that, we've also, and this is a real significance for us, we're looking at this year, we've teamed up with our colleagues in the Department of Education and Chester University to train local CBT therapists, and that's a 2-year programme, and that's going to start in the second quarter of this year. So that's looking at harvesting local talent on the island, given the opportunity to train as CBT therapists and work both within our services and the wider third sector. So that's a fantastic initiative that we're enormously proud of.
If money was no object, and I have to say, and I'm sure you agree, this issue can be far from resolved from just throwing money at it.
Absolutely.
Would there be an argument for having a crisis team, almost a mental health A&E equivalent?
Well, yeah, we do. I mean, we have a crisis team at the moment that kind of acts in that capacity, dealing with.
But in terms of 24/7, I mean,
it's a 24/7 provision at the moment, James. We have it's covered 24/7, 7 days a week, and we're actually remodelling the way that crisis team operates and looking at adding a more additional staff to that service. So really bolstering our response to people, making sure that people are seen and assessed in a timely fashion, and then have access to the right care pathway.
If that's in place, then in that case, why are so many people of all ages falling through the cracks?
Well, I think with all the will in the world, James, the mental health service is never going to be the answer to the mental health and emotional well-being difficulties on the island. We're a very, very important cog in the wheel, but we're absolutely a cog in the wheel. And I think that's where that collaborative approach comes in with our third sector colleagues. Absolutely, we're in the process of investing more, but we're also reliant on individual and community resilience, people working together, talking to each other, taking responsibility for their own emotional well-being. And some of the 5 ways to well-being that I spoke about last week is good examples of how we can do that. We've all got a responsibility to look after our own emotional well-being. You referred it to as a precious asset, and I don't think there is a more precious asset. So it's really important that we take care of that.
Well, Professor Davidson, and if I can just bring you in at this point, I think on your website, the iListen website, it says 1 in 4 people have mental illness. But the reality is that all of us have mental health, I suppose. So generally, and everyone's different, how can individuals even begin to keep their mental health in check? How can we monitor our mental health?
Well, just let me say, Ross was talking there about, and I want to start on a positive note. I mean, I've worked on the island with people who have got cancer and looking at their psychological needs and how people get depressed. But one thing that always strikes me, James, is that people who have got it's not the number of people who are dealing with cancer, for example, who are depressed, but the number who aren't. The actual resilience that people can show, it never ceases. It's very humbling for me. And in the 6 years of the Second World War, we saw that as well. And in this seemingly endless pandemic, it's a testimony to human resilience that 2/3 of people, even 3/4 of people, report that they're doing okay mentally. Now, that means that obviously there's a quarter of people who perhaps have issues or will have issues around mainly anxiety and depression, kicked in by loneliness. Loneliness is the key precipitant of all of this, and financial difficulties. Those are the big two that cause mental health issues. So obviously some people are depressed and some people are anxious, and they're different things. And we've got data to suggest that people in the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody was fight and flight and edgy and so on, and scared and stressed, anxiety was more of an issue. But as time's gone on, that anxiety has decreased, and we have noticed more depression coming in. People are kind of losing heart. They're thinking that this is going on forever. They heard Professor Whitty the other day saying there was going to be another surge at Christmas. We're hearing people saying that the social distancing might go on for years. And this has led to an increase in depression a little bit. There's a lifetime prevalence of depression of about 8%. 8% of people. In the latter part of this pandemic in the UK, it's kicking in at around 14. It's nearly doubled. So the issue of anxiety at the beginning of the pandemic leading into kind of a propensity to depression now among people is concerning. And that's what I think we have to look at the moment.
And how then, thank you, and how, going back to the original question then, how can we as individuals keep our mental health in check? How do we even begin to start that process?
Well, there's a lot of people, everybody says that you have to exercise, you have to talk to people, you have to mitigate against loneliness, you have to set targets and all of these sorts of things. And that's fine. It's very easy to say. Sometimes it's harder to do. I think the key thing, if you're getting depressed, is to search very hard to form a structure. Depression is caused by a sense of hopelessness and loss of control. And the one thing that we do in therapy for people who are getting depressed, who are lacking in motivation, who are wearing their pajamas all day, who just have lost an interest, is to begin to try to help them through perhaps CBT or something like that, or self-help, to gain a little bit of control back into their life and to get a structure and to get sensible aims. It's called behavioural activation in clinical terms, but that's what it really means. And I think that has to be the focus as the pandemic moves forward into this phase that we're looking at.
Ross Bailey?
Yeah, I think Robin made some really salient points. I think I'm sure Robin will agree, and Robin, I'm sure, will expand on this, how important it is that people learn to understand their own emotions and recognise when there's changes that might represent a deterioration in mood, Robin, catching that early, understanding your own emotions, understanding how that affects your behaviour, and then doing something about it is absolutely the key. And also recognising that in other people and reaching out to support them. Robbie might want to speak a bit more in detail about that.
Well, just let me, you're talking about managing our emotions here. I mean, we've often heard it decades ago, sort of the phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, and all that, names will never hurt me. That was often the phrase that we used to be told by our parents to sort of ward off the bullies in the playground, etc. And we know now that those sort of unkind and cruel utterings of children and adults can hurt deeply and leave scars with some people for years. But we also know that traditional British stoicism, the stiff upper lip approach in the face of adversity, that resoluteness is now sniggered at in some quarters. So when you go back and just use those two as an example, as a professional, has that approach, that attitude of yesteryear left a generation or two flawed, incapable of showing emotion?
Well, I think, arguably, yes. I think, we're not great enough, particularly in the case of men as well. I think, that's pretty well evidenced that, without stereotyping, men have typically found it more difficult to express their emotions and reach out for support. And and tragically, at times that's reflected in the suicide data. But I think, you know, our ability to notice when and first of all, I think it's, you know, we've come on leaps and bounds in the last couple of decades in terms of our understanding of mental health problems, of emotional well-being. You know, how we speak more about, openly speak about our emotions more. But there's still an awful long way to go, James. You know, and our ability to recognise shifts and changes. You know, things, for instance, you know, there's a I think it's a Greek terminology, anhedonia, which basically means a loss of interest in things that we used to typically found interesting. You know, and that's a key symptom of depression, and something we absolutely look out for. As this kind of sense of, you know, helplessness or hopelessness, you know, a lack of sleep, a loss of appetite. There's a whole multitude of symptoms that we look out for. I mean, if we can you know, improve the community and public's awareness of those things, that can only be a good thing.
Where do you strike that balance between talking about something and, in many ways, helping yourself before you even get to that stage? And I mean this most respectfully. Obviously, it illustrates how time has changed, but you often heard, not so much now, you heard the phrase pull yourself together or man up. Pull yourself up. For example, is it always wrong to utter phrases like that? Or tell me, and that's terminology from days gone by, but with regards to mental and emotional health, yes, times have changed, but have we become less resilient today?
I'm not sure we've become less resilient. I think the resilience is an enormous spectrum, isn't it? I think, you know, and that's dependent on our experiences in lives, you know, our opportunities in lives, you know, arguably our DNA. So, you know, our ability to cope, just like, you know, some people are more prone to coughs and colds and chest infections, and others seem to sort of flit through life without it. You know, it is a huge spectrum. And when you notice a shift in your own resilience, when you notice that things are changing for you, that should be the trigger. And that self-awareness is so key. So,
Lynsey, sorry, yes.
I think a lot of the work that we do as part of our Listen is very much around what you're saying there, James and Ross. It's around encouraging people to become aware of mental illness, about mental health, about their own mental health, about what is right for them, what feels right for them, when to acknowledge and understand that actually things might be changing for them, for individuals and for the people around them. It's about sort of encouraging those open conversations around mental health, and that's really one of the key things that we do with I'll Listen. And when we go into schools and we do training and teaching in lessons and in assemblies, is very much around trying to normalise mental health and get those conversations going and get people really aware of mental health as an overview, and also what is okay for people and what's right for people and what people understand about mental health.
You say schools there. I mean, never before have the words emotional well-being and mental health been so used, whether that be in the media, in hospitals, in schools. And I see next week at Ramsey Grammar School, for example, there's an initiative, an online mental health initiative. Lynsey, how important are initiatives like that where there is concern for early intervention? Because I know that the evidence base universally asserts that the sooner you do something about it, the better the outcome.
Absolutely, and that's really where I'll Listen as a charitable initiative was really born from. It came about a couple of years ago that we realised that there was a place for early intervention on the island in terms of mental health with young people, and that's really our vision, and our goal is about early intervention with young people, school-aged, primarily currently within secondary schools, but our hope is that will grow into primary age schools. But it's absolutely imperative that there is early intervention and that there is provision put into place for young people to really focus and support their mental health at whatever level, and we are that is our goal, is early intervention.
And what key messages, Lynsey, if I may, sorry to interrupt you, what key messages, when I'll Listen goes to the schools, what the key messages in your campaign?
Absolutely, the communication is key. So whether that is communication with your peers, with your family, with teachers, with other support systems, communication is absolutely key. So really being able and feeling able to say, do you know what, I'm not okay today, and I'm struggling and I need some help, on whatever level that is. So communication is absolutely imperative. Really about what Ross said just before about listening to your emotions and your feelings. So really having that awareness and validating when you're not feeling okay. So really listening to your body, really listening to your thoughts and feelings is absolutely crucial. And things about like keeping a routine, like Robin said, that is really important. It's to have that routine, but ensure that there's a bit of flexibility in that. Don't be very rigid to the point where you're sort of almost putting barriers in place. So keep a routine as much as possible, but allow that flexibility. So they're sort of our key messages. So it's very much about communication. It's very much about listening to your own feelings and validating them and those around you, and about keeping a routine where possible, but allowing that flexibility.
If, Professor Davidson, you find yourself down during self-isolation, how easy can it be to sort of slip into that mindset that you are alone?
Oh, it can be very easy, and I draw the distinction between loneliness and self-isolation. Loneliness is that place when you feel that there's no one there, there's no one to talk to, that you're isolated not only geographically but mentally. And then it's very easy to slip into depression. I actually think that all the data we've got now has shown that people who are particularly vulnerable to that are obviously people who have had a pre-existing mental health condition, but also younger people, paradoxically, between the ages of 15 maybe and 30, and particularly women. And study after study after study has shown us that particularly young women are finding it particularly difficult, and the loneliness and prone to depression as a result of lockdown. I think it's terribly important to recognize when people are slipping into depression as a result of particularly loneliness and getting into that sense of helplessness. And I want to go back to what you said there, James, about how we view mental illness. I think one good thing that's happened, there used to be the stiff upper lip, the resilience, everybody, just first step forward and so on. I think people are talking about it more. There was a tendency years ago to maybe rely on antidepressants and all of these sorts of things and so on. Now people are realizing that actually opening up about personal insecurities, about our own problems, actually works. A problem shared, I know it's an old-fashioned thing to say, but a problem shared is a problem, maybe not halved, but is a problem reduced. So I think I'm a wee bit more optimistic than some others about the fact that we are now opening up about our own vulnerabilities. As Ross said, men are more able now to talk about issues like this. So the field is improving. We're not relying on drugs, and we're not relying on all of that. We are being more open about our mental health, and I think that can only be important.
Some moods are low right now, of course they are, but even in normal times, however you define that, aren't variations in moods part of their normal day-to-day practice, aren't they?
Absolutely, and I think we've always got to be careful. I use the term we mustn't pathologize ordinary moods. We mustn't suddenly turn sadness into clinical depression, and we mustn't suddenly turn stressed out into an anxiety state. There's a danger of turning ordinary moods that we all suffer, and we're variable, and everybody gets sad, everybody gets a bit tense, everybody gets scared, everybody gets lonely. These are normal conditions, and we mustn't pathologize them and make them into a mental illness or a mental health issue. I think it's important to draw that distinction, that the very nature of the human condition is that we must feel sad sometimes. how we define resilience is not stopping us feel sad or stopping us feeling depressed. It's how soon that we can kick back out of that state. That's what resilience means.
How at this time, how are you as a charity, either Professor Davidson or Lynsey, how are you offering emotional support to family, to friends, to co-workers who have been quarantined?
So currently at the moment, we're still offering support as we always have. Obviously, we can't do that face-to-face at the moment because of the government restrictions, but we are offering video calls via Zoom or Microsoft Teams. We're doing telephone calls to clients, so that is still ongoing. So we've still got that connection with people, so we can still do that. In terms of what we would offer usually out to businesses, we're still offering training and support as we always would. And we've had to obviously adapt and modify how we offer support, but we still are very much offering support. We welcome, if people have got worries or concerns, you can get in touch with us. There are a wealth of other services on the island who you can reach out to, but I think it's important to realise that there is support out there for people.
So obviously our Listen's one of a number of charities and third sector organisations which provides remarkable yet often under-acknowledged services to our community. As a society, Ross, do we widely appreciate, just on the point that Professor Davidson's been talking about there, do we widely appreciate, do you think, that it is okay not to be okay? Or is there still some way to go in that?
I think there's still some way to go in there. I think we've got a responsibility, and as a mental health service, of working with our colleagues to really market and promote some of the services that are up there, and also enable the public and the community to make sense of them, because we've got some incredible kind of pockets of amazing practice and incredible charities doing incredible work. But we do need to be more joined up in the way that we deliver services, and the mental health services and government's got a responsibility to do that, and it's something we're absolutely and extremely keen to do.
How is the service refocusing its refocusing on emotional well-being?
Yeah. I think historically the mental health services, this is always going to be our core business as a statutory service. We're going to be our major focus is on those people suffering with moderate to severe mental illnesses and mental health problems. And I think that's been our sole focus for historically. What we're really looking at now are those lower steps and how we can work with more preventative methods and make sure that the wider community, some of those more low to moderate mental health problems, are receiving the support and treatment in a timely fashion. So our model of delivery is what we call the stepped care model, if you like. So it starts with step 0 and goes up to step 5. And if you just bear with me a second, James, I'll try and explain. So step 0 really is the kind of the emotional resilience, our own individual and collective responsibilities to look after our mental health. Much of what we've been discussing about today. Step 1 really is primary care. So if that's not working, you might go and see your GP. You might access Listen. You might access another a third sector charity. So when things are getting a little bit more challenging for you, or you're struggling. Step 2 is for an example, is our community wellbeing service. So that's our some of our therapists and psychologists and OTs who are going to be working and do work, but that's the service we're increasing the size of, who are going to be embedded within primary care. Step 3 is your community mental health teams, your older persons teams, your community health teams for adults. Step 4, inpatient services, and step 5 is where some people need absolute specialised, usually off-island provision, and that's a tiny proportion. So it really is a kind of a triangle. What we've historically underinvested in, not just financially but also in time and energy, are those lower steps, those preventative steps, and enabling people, the wider community, to access treatment and support an early opportunity. That's our focus in addition to our core business, and that's a major shift for us.
I think we heard last week alone, there were 16 calls to the emergency joint control room. related to mental health issues. We know one person attempted to take their own life. I think there were 11 calls of people making threats of suicide. What support network, and Lynsey's touched on it here, and it is a far wider support network, but what support network agencies are in place for these people and their loved ones when they can't wait for an appointment, when they need help now? I mean, you mentioned the 24/7 earlier, but it's not as simple as that, is it?
Well, I think we look after, James, we look after around about 6% of the island's population on mental health services caseload at the moment, and that's increasing year on year. So we're looking after around about sort of approaching 5,000 people at the moment, and the numbers are going up. And I think we can, as I alluded to earlier, with the experience of this pandemic, we can see that continuing to happen. The crisis team, I mean, if you're experiencing profound acute mental health problems and there's real concerns in terms of the risk of harm to self or risk of harm to self, then that crisis team is there, the number's there, and we're looking to make that a free phone number in the very near future. And that is a 24/7 provision. We also, out of hours, we have an approved social worker on call. We have two consultant psychiatrists on call. So there's a range of provision to act very, very quickly.
But what when a phone call's not enough?
Well, the initial phone call, James, is to understand what the problem is, and then ensure that person gets access to the treatment, what we call the care pathway, in the right time. So really,
some of those treatments are available 24/7, but others aren't.
Well, I think I'm certainly not going to sit here and defend some of the issues we've got in terms of access to talking therapies at the time. I wouldn't, it's unacceptable. But what's very clear to us is that we are doing something about it. We've now secured the funding to do that. We're now going out to recruitment. We're looking at training therapists on island and tapping into that local talent pool so we can upskill and train accredited therapists. So by the end of this year, we'll be in an absolutely much better place. And our expectations in terms of what we call our key outcomes are going to be far beyond what the NHS UK NHS set as targets. So we're anticipating within the next 2 years potentially, we'll be far exceeding the wait times that are currently offered by the NHS.
What has prompted this? I wouldn't say sea change because that would be harsh, but what has prompted this realisation that there needs to be a significant investment, and I'm not just talking financially here, island-wide?
Well, I think in the last few years, the mental health service, there's been a real acknowledgement and greater understanding of the emotional impact and the mental health needs of our population. We're much more open to speaking about it. There's much more press related coverage of it. So there's a much more greater understanding of how crucial having access to treatment and support is. So we're really, like I said, and I want to repeat it, we're really keen that we're working with all the providers in our third sectors to make sure that people have access to the support, the right support at the right place at the right time.
But Professor Davidson, any general findings that that stand out for you over the last 12 months or so in terms of figures during and after and then before lockdown, part 2, part 3?
Yeah, I think, as I said, depression has increased from maybe 8% to 15% as lockdown has gone on. Anxiety has perhaps gone down a little. People who think about suicide, seriously think about suicide, it's called suicide ideation. That's about 3% at any one time of the population. It's a little bit higher than we think. There's some very serious studies that have gone on in lockdown and say that's jumped to almost 10%. So the idea of getting depressed over the last year and thinking about self-harm has actually increased. We think that the number of people who do actually attempt suicide has increased. We think that other things, particularly domestic violence, people who are shut down in their own homes with no other things to do, that has increased. And one of the other things that disturbs me particularly is that we're drinking as a population, and the Isle of Man's no different, a third more than we did before lockdown. So the amount of alcohol as a coping strategy has increased dramatically in the last year, and that leads to impulsive behavior like suicidal ideation, like domestic violence, like these sorts of things. So I think it's a whole other area, but we've got to look very carefully at alcohol use particularly, as opposed to other drugs, but alcohol use particularly as a precursor to some of the things you've been talking to Ross about.
Any, and I'll open this one to all of you really then, in that case, any tips, particularly hints of how to best get through lockdown?
So I think for myself, is very much around trying to keep a routine like we spoke about before. So trying to keep a routine as much as possible, trying to really focus on getting a good night's sleep and trying to keep that as a routine. I know that can be really difficult, but it is really important that people are trying to get sort of around 8 hours sleep a night, roughly, or thereabouts. Really focus on, trying to keep active and maybe think about new interests. Try to think about what really sort of sets your soul going, and think about things that really interest you and focused on that. And really thinking about strategies for when you are feeling particularly low, you are feeling perhaps particularly down or anxious. Think about what has worked for you in the past. So whether that's around distraction, sort of speaking to other people and keeping connected with other people. We are a human race that thrives on human connectedness, and that is really important. It's really about thinking about what has worked for you in the past and what can work for you going forward.
I'll speak personally as well here. I have three sons and 4 grandchildren, all living in England, and I haven't seen them really since last March. And you get a bit disheartened when you can't see your family and you're in a bubble, and you've also got the added problem of what if I get COVID? So at the middle of lockdown around Christmas, I got a bit disheartened really, and I felt myself sort of drifting, not being able to see family and so on. So I kind of began to structure my life a bit more. I properly organized on a daily basis Zoom conversations with the family. I tried to read a book, and let that go. And I tried to get a bit of structure to my life, because it's very easy just to drift into a kind of sort of depressed, as Ross said, anhedonia is a good word for it. So I tried to add a bit of structure, and that's worked.
They're all coping techniques. I mean, this is something that you, as the head of mental health, speak a lot about, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really I'd point people towards the It's Your OK campaign and some of the fantastic guidance and support and tips, if you like, that are available within those 5 ways to wellbeing. So I mean, I really would point people towards that. It's a fantastic resource, and also to highlight that James, we have an online counselling platform that the community's got access to, and we have Quell, which is our adult platform, and Couth, which is tailored and targeted for younger people. And there you have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, access to qualified staff that you can speak to regarding your emotional well-being. They're qualified therapists. There's chat rooms as well online. So that's a great resource that people are able to tap into. But certainly echoing, the fantastic advice that Lynsey and Robin have given. That connectivity, making sure that you connect with people. And for me, as I mentioned, I'm a dad of 3 kids under 10. My wife's a teacher. I'm really, really conscious of the impact this has had on our young community and our community as a whole. Making sure that we're reaching out. We're staying connected is enormously important.
There's a toolbox of messages, if you like. This 5 ways to well-being, isn't it? It's all online.
It is, absolutely. I mean, so it starts off with the connecting with people. Talking and listening. Be there for individuals, and certainly understanding your own emotional well-being. And then we move on to kind of be active. And as I spoke about last week, there's a wealth of evidence that talks about the value of physical exercise in terms of people's emotional well-being and their mental health. It can have a profound positive impact on your mental health, and where's no better place to enjoy it than the Isle of Man. It's as a bloke from southeast London, I'm only too conscious and still in awe of what a beautiful place the Isle of Man is. So we should try and enjoy it. Keep learning. Making sure that we do take the opportunities. Rediscovering old interests and embracing new experiences. As difficult as that sometimes can be, it can be really, really stimulating and help you emotionally. Give. I mean, there's no better feeling than giving, is there? And doing something nice for people. And there's all sorts of evidence in terms of the impact that has on our neurons and how that makes us feel good. And taking notice. And this is really what I've been trying to focus on: us being aware of our own emotional well-being and the emotional well-being of other people, and starting those meaningful conversations with people is nothing more important than that.
You've swapped, by the sounds of it, you've swapped jelly deals for Queenies then, have you?
I'm partial to it. I'm not going to hit the stereotype. I'm not from the East End of London.
No,
I don't mind it, but I've probably eaten so much shellfish since I've here. I'm surprised I'm not walking sideways, James.
Absolutely.
It's I've avoided the chip, cheese and gravy bit, but the shellfish certainly.
You're a fortunate man. Obviously, we talk about wellbeing messages, their coping techniques. Our Listen, Lynsey, has a coping circle, really, doesn't it?
We do. So it's something that we quite often use within therapy, and it's something that we have been very keen to a message to bring to the Isle of Man public is around how we cope and what we really can control within our lives. So the circle of control is a set of three interconnected circles, if you'd like, and it very much focuses on what we can control, on what we can influence, and what we have no control over. And the idea of the circle of control is very much that we really try to focus as much as possible on what we can control. And when we focus on what we can't control, if we spend too much time in thinking about things we can't control, that can have a real detrimental impact to our mental health and our mental well-being. We can start to feel very disillusioned with life. So it really trying to focus on other aspects rather than on what we can't control is really important. Obviously, there are things in life that we can influence, and that's really important that we can identify some of those things that we can influence and have an impact on. We can try and make a real difference, and that can really help with our well-being. But I think the real important things are those things that we can control. It's really about focusing on and really putting our energy into the things that we can really see, make a change with and have an impact on, and that can really impact in a positive way our mental health and well-being, especially in times like we're in at the minute, and where life can feel very much out of control.
Professor Davidson, you mentioned grandchildren there. I mean, at the end of all of this, I suppose each and every family will have tales to regale to their grandchildren, a different story. There might be unexpected success. There will be those very much at the other end of the scale where personal lives and businesses have been decimated, a depression or debt, but potentially worse, serious illness. What advice would you give to those people? What initial advice would you give to those people at the more serious end of that scale?
Well, they talk about long COVID, and there's also long mental health issues with regard to COVID. It's not all just acute. Sometimes these aren't going to go away, the financial problems and so on. If I could give one piece of advice, and it's based on what Lynsey's just said, the very essence of mental illness is learned helplessness. It's called loss of control. And if we can help people get back control in tiny bits of their life and build on that control, the very worst emotion is to feel totally helpless, and that leads to clinical depression. And so I would endorse precisely what Lynsey said. If I could give one piece of advice, it's to try to gradually control those things that you can control. Critically important. The most important piece of advice I think you can have for people who are suffering from depression or indeed anxiety.
Ross, our modern day mental and emotional health vocabulary has changed, has it not? Because I mean, you know, PTSD now, that used to be shell shock if you came back from the war on the battle-strewn fields of Europe. I mean, has it always been there? It's just better understood now. Yeah,
absolutely. You know, this isn't something that's just emerged. It's always been there. It's either called something differently or ignored or swept under the carpet. So it's always been there. I think we've got a much better understanding. There's much more investment and resources spent in research in terms of trying to understand it. So you know, that's continuing. But we you know, in terms of anxiety, depression, and the whole gamut of mental health problems, you know, we've got a pretty good idea of what works. In terms of those moderate severe mental health problems, you know, it's my service's responsibility to make sure that those treatments and services are there and you know, and afforded in a timely fashion. But just reiterating what Robin and Lynsey have said, you know, there's a huge amount that people can do themselves, and that's really important. And that, you know, that focus on controlling things that you can control is a fantastic message.
Distancing, closing of schools, workplaces, I suppose not doing the things we love, whether taking the kids to the park, going to sport, going to the theatre, seeing family and friends, all this affects what we love to do. All this affects where we want to be and who we want to be with, and that creates social isolation. So if we pay more attention to the present moment, to changes in our own thoughts, how much of a help is that to well-being? How far can it go? Because to some people that will be enough, to others it will presumably just be a tip. Yeah.
I think, you know, we are inherently social creatures, aren't we? We like being around other people. That gives us a sense of joy. And when access to that is taken away, we need to adapt. So, you know, engaging in regular telephone calls with people, engaging in Zoom calls with people, reaching out and connecting with people, you know, is incredibly important. And not to lose sight of that and not to let that slip is absolutely crucial.
Professor Davidson, we're just coming to the end of this now, but what would you say has there been any particular aspect which has heartened you over the last 12 months, where perhaps as a society we have learnt and developed and adapted from this pandemic and all the feelings that has caused?
As I said earlier on, I think that what has heartened me is that looking at the figures, nearly 70% of people say they're coping with this huge change in their life reasonably or quite well. And that sense of the resilience of the population of the Isle of Man and the United Kingdom heartens me. I think the other thing which I would say is that in mental health treatment now, we use a lot of cognitive behavior therapy and we use a lot of mindfulness. And mindfulness has become very popular as a therapy that's delivered on the Isle of Man and elsewhere. And mindfulness is teaching people to carpe diem, as you were saying, James, a second ago, is to grab the day, to understand the present, not to focus necessarily on the past, not to focus necessarily on the future. And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of therapy and so on. But to be able to focus on the here and now, that mindfulness is now very popular as a treatment in mental health care. So what strikes me is what's happened. I think people are resilient. I think it's taught us to talk about things. I would never have dreamed doing this interview a year ago about talking about my own grandchildren. I would have talked about research and data and all of this stuff. But now I feel that because of a year of lockdown, slightly more personal about this. It's not all about science and it's not all about statistics. I can actually feel comfortable about relating my own story. And I think that's something positive that's come out in all of us in the last year.
There are many charities, organisations, third sector organisations who are here to help in their specialist areas. Lynsey, just from an Our Listen perspective, where can people find out more?
So people can go onto our website, onto irlisten.im. There's a whole wealth of resources on there in terms of downloadable documents, YouTube videos and clips, hints and tips. There's a whole wealth of knowledge on there. There's also sort of pinpoints to other charities on the island as well. Again, there's a wealth of knowledge and experience on the Isle of Man through various other services, the Samaritans, to name just one. But there is a whole wealth of knowledge out there, and I would really urge people, if you do feel like you need support, if you feel like you're not able to get that support from family and friends, and you need something more, please reach out, please speak up and get the support that you need.
I'm sure that is probably something, Ross, that you would endorse.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the, again, I'll refer back to the Are You OK campaign, which also has a wealth of information and advice and signpost people to a huge range of third sector organisations who can be there to provide, invaluable help and support. So, I would urge people to access that resource.
Thank you. The details have just been on the screen. We could talk, there were so many avenues we could explore here. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
To Lynsey Christian, Professor Robin Davidson and Ross Bailey, very much appreciated and good to speak to you this afternoon. Hopefully this webinar has been helpful, especially for those of you who are struggling mentally and or emotionally with this current lockdown. Caring about our emotional well-being, I'm sure you agree, has never been more important. Thanks for your company. Keep talking and take care of yourself. Goodbye.